Good morning. I'm Jerry Allmark, and on behalf of the UK Telehealthcare team, I would like to welcome you to our second event of 2023. Our first event of the year, which was held last Wednesday, gave our delegates the opportunity to put questions to the major tech suppliers about their readiness for the analog to digital switchover. If you missed that event, the recording's available on the events page of our website. Today's event follows on and gives delegates the chance to put questions to the communications and infrastructure providers, NHS England, local government, and other professional interest groups. We've already received a number of questions for the panel, but this is your chance to join the discussion, and you can post your questions in the chat box. Please make sure that your chat box is set to post to everyone so that everyone can share in the questions and the answers. Or you can raise your hand and, time permitting, we'll let you in to ask the questions directly. If you're tweeting about the event, please use the hashtag @UKTHCnews on the Twitter handle. The event today will be recorded and is also live streamed on YouTube. The panel session today will be facilitated by Steve Smith of Tax Advisory, who are now partnering with us to provide consultation services to UK telehealthcare members, as well as the wider tax industry. You can find out more details about the partnership on the news page of our website. I'd now like to hand you over to Steve and the panel, and I will see you at the end of the session today. Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Yes, good morning, everybody. The panel will have a number of names and faces you recognise from past events, but there are one or two new names in there as well. So I'm sure you'll treat them well and give them a warm reception. I won't go through all the names now. You've seen those, and as I said, you know most of those people. But what I would say to the panelists, if you want to do a quick introduction of yourself and your organisation, just in case there are new members that have not come across you in the past. So we've got a number of questions that have been asked in advance, and I'm going to try and allocate those to people as I think most appropriate to make sure all the panelists get involved. But I would really encourage you as delegates to this conference to put your hand up, raise questions as and when appropriate. And we're going to try something new on this call, which is to perhaps ask one or two questions, or the panelists might ask all the attendees a question and ask you to raise your hand. I didn't know how to do it yesterday, but I now know how to actually figure out how many people are putting their hand up and hopefully work out the percentage. So we might give that a try at some point today. So rather than me rabbit on, I'm going to actually kick this off. I'm not sure whether Sodi's on the call at this. Oh, you are, Sodi. So that's brilliant. So if I may, the first question is one for yourself. And it actually comes from John Patterson at the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. And the question for you, Sodi, is what are CPs doing to mitigate power failures? Should it be the responsibility of telecare service providers to provide a SIM? I wonder if that also relates to a power supply, but perhaps you could comment both in terms of should a device have a backup SIM in the event of a failure of service, but also potentially, should it have a better backup power supply? This is the router I'm talking about, than perhaps the 1 hour that's generally being discussed. And forgive me if that's moved on. Oh, I think you're on mute, Sodi, or certainly can't hear you. Nope, I'm sorry, Sodi. It's still quiet. Perhaps what we can do, I'll give you a moment to try and sort out your technical bits. If I could move on to David Christie. So we have a question from Adrian Scaife at the Access Group. So David, one for you at Virgin Media. For current landline-only customers, what will their new digital voice service look like, e.g. open 500 kb connection, question mark?
I'll do my best to answer that, and apologies in advance for my lack of technical knowledge. But it's a good question. So we've got a number of what we call telco solus customers who only take telephone services, don't take broadband services from us, and they will be migrated in due course to digital voice. That will involve them being given a router, so a broadband hub, which will have the requisite connection to the IP voice service, and it will allow a limited broadband service to power that telephony service. So essentially, it will be low bandwidth. I don't know the exact spec of it, but it won't allow, or a customer won't get broadband services as we know them by virtue of that telephony connection, even though it is effectively a low grade in terms of speed broadband service. Now, having said that, the quality of service requirements that we've got for providing telephony will still have to be met. So when I say low grade, it's solely in relation to bandwidth speed. It's a fully capable service that meets appropriate quality standards. One thing that, for example, you may want to consider as an individual or as an organization, if you have a device that requires broadband to support it, because it has additional monitoring connections that specifically are data driven and need a broadband connection, then an IP voice telephony connection, even though it's over the broadband, wouldn't work in itself. So that's the only caveat. But no, absolutely, Solus Voice will get the hub. It will be supported, but it won't need the customer to upgrade to broadband, pay for broadband in any other way. And just to say as well, our policy at the moment is to ensure that we get technicians doing the installs for any vulnerable customers. And I think questions just come in on power fail on that. So where we have vulnerable customers, that install will include the provision of what we call an emergency backup line, which is a unit that contains both a SIM and power supply. So in the event of a power fail situation, the customer will retain the ability to make calls over that separate device. So that's provided to vulnerable customers.
So that David,
what we say is that in relation. Go ahead, Steve.
Sorry, I thought you'd stopped. I think there's a slight interruption, so please carry on.
Yeah, what we say is that obviously is supportive for voice calls, but for connected devices such as care alarms, telehealth devices, we recommend that those have their own backup connectivity. So going back to Sodi's question, we would say yes, the device that you are connecting should have its own power backup, but also its own network backup, so an inbuilt SIM card as well.
So are you rolling that out to everybody that has a telecare device at the moment, David, or are you saying those vulnerable people?
So everybody would be migrated in the same way. So the standard backup unit is that device that provides power and a SIM card to make calls to voice line numbers. But yes, so we would advise anybody with a telecare device that they should be migrating their device to one with its own SIM card backup.
So right, sorry, that's not a service that Virgin Media are providing.
No, that's correct.
Okay, and if somebody is plugging in a traditional analog device, and I know this is quite controversial, but plugging in an analog device into the voice port or the ATA on the router, what sort of power backup will the router have? Because clearly, once the router fails through a lack of power, then the connection fails as well.
Yeah, so the power backup for our system, and this will vary between different CPs. So this is very much Virgin Media specific, and Sodi and Phil will be able to tell you about BT and TalkTalk's option. Our power backup is in the separate unit, the backup line unit. So the router itself is not backed up, but there's a separate device that is backed up. We do know that people have plugged devices into that separate backup unit, but our advice is that's not a recommended approach.
And roughly how much resilience will that give? Is it sort of 4 hours, 8 hours?
We've got a couple of devices that we use at the moment. Both provide at least 8 hours backup.
Okay, that's good. Sodi, are we able to hear you now, do you think? Oh, no. Okay, sorry, we'll come back to you in due course, Sodi. But Phil, perhaps you can provide a comment on that?
Yeah, so really, as David just said, every CP will have its own way of doing this. From TalkTalk's point of view, we will be providing vulnerable customers with a battery backup for the router, which would keep that working. If it's fiber to the premise, so fiber right the way through, and it terminates in the premises with an ONT, or I think it's optical network terminal, that needs backing up as well. And so in that case, you would receive 2 battery backup units for that place. From our point of view, we don't sort of recommend or not recommend having a mobile backup path. That's really for the manufacturers to decide. So from TalkTalk point of view, the battery backup is what does the job. So in effect, if power did go down, there would need to be three battery backups. There would need to be one for the ONT, which keeps the network open, one for the router, which will keep the router going, and then obviously the telecare unit would have its own battery backup as well to be able to send the signal. So that's how it would work in TalkTalk's area.
Yeah. And so there is nothing within a sort of a universal service obligation around this length of time the telecommunications path should remain open at all.
I believe, I don't think it's changed. I believe the sort of requirement is from Ofcom is to be able to make voice calls for a period of 1 hour. And I don't think that's changed. I know it's being looked at and people are looking to make it longer. And I think, our battery backup units, don't suddenly at 59 minutes and 59 seconds run out of power. But that is the limitation. But I know there is work going on. Everybody would like it to be longer. And of course, you can have it as long as you want, but the battery gets bigger and the cost gets bigger as well. So there's got to be some point. So John Livermore just prompted me there to say that the requirements is to be able to make a 999 call, by the way, not to be able to phone your local takeaway or anybody else. It is the requirement is to be able to make a 999 call.
Yeah. Okay, so there is a subsequent question. We'll stick with you just for the moment, yep. Phil, which is, so would I be able to plug in my IP social arm into the Solus router? I don't know whether Solus...
Solus is a Virgin product, fortunately, so I don't have to answer that one.
Okay. David, have you got an observation on a Solus router?
Yeah. I mean, the word Solus is just an internal word we use for customers who take one product. So if they are just taking telephone products, then they would be a Solus telephone product user. The router itself is just standard. So this is the standard routers that we will provide to any customer with broadband, and therefore it'll have all of the same connections. The service that's provided over it will be for those telco customers who only take telephone services, will be that limited what they need to run their IP voice service over it. But all of the connections will be standard in terms of the ports, the ATA port, which has been mentioned. Ethernet.
Okay. Oh, sorry, we've got a bit of an echo with you, David. So we're having all sorts of fun this morning.
Hello, Steve. Can you hear me now?
We can, Sodi. Welcome. What was the problem?
I had to turn it off and turn it on again. So a very technical problem. Apologies. I'm not deliberately trying to avoid John Patterson's question, but I'm so glad that my fellow compatriots have managed to answer it, hopefully. But yeah, just to add, I think as has been said by the guys, by David and Phil, just to echo, the Ofcom general condition is, as John says, access to emergency services. The customer is able to contact emergency services for at least an hour in the event of a power failure, given that the new technology doesn't provide power over the landline. I think it's also important to note that the telecom providers have never been responsible for powering third-party devices, and telecare equipment is third-party devices connected to the network. Our obligation is obviously with our network, and Ofcom's given a clear kind of guidance there that we need to ensure that there is that resilience. In terms of BT consumer or EE, as we're moving to, in terms of what we're providing, we are providing customers with several resilience options. So we have battery backup units, which will be made available to eligible customers, and those will keep the router powered up, so all services will carry on working, voice calls and data. But we're also offering some customers hybrid phones. So these are corded phones that will work over the digital voice or the VoIP service in normal circumstances, and then they will fall back to a built-in SIM for mobile access in the event of a power cut. Okay, and that's where we see there's flexibility there to give customers the right solution depending on their need. But unfortunately, going back to John's point, but it is the responsibility of those third-party equipment providers to provide the necessary resilience to ensure that service keeps working, whether it's using SIMs or other ways of backing up the service. Okay, I think there's some questions coming. I think someone said, I think Aaron, what defines eligible. So just in simple terms is where battery backup units, they're big, they're cumbersome, not all customers want them or will need them. So when it comes to vulnerable customers, we're trying to offer where customers can use the hybrid phone and they've got sufficient mobile coverage, then a hybrid solution suffices. But if in an area where they've got patchy mobile, poor mobile, then of course they'll be provided with a battery backup unit. Okay.
No, that's fine. Phil, why are providers leaving vulnerable people without their lifeline connected when they install their new digital line? I would like to think that is not happening, and I'm sure the CPs all have a policy, and we'll have a quick round robin on this. But if you could start with yourself, Phil, what will your policy be?
Well, in actual fact, and this isn't me trying to develop a pair of slopey shoulders, our policy isn't set yet, and so at the moment we're not migrating anybody who is a vulnerable customer or potentially vulnerable customer for that very reason. We're working closely with the other providers and with Openreach to try and come up with an on-the-day experience that will stop that happening. But as it stands today, TalkTalk isn't migrating any customers in this situation, so it's not really something that I can comment on other than to say we're working very closely with the others to try and come up with a policy that will work for everybody, and will not put customers in this situation.
Okay, and Sodi, is that likewise, or?
It is likewise. I think, none of us want to leave a customer disconnected. So, as you probably know, we've paused our bulk migration, and it is still paused. And one of the areas that when we restart that we want to tighten down is avoiding this scenario where customers get left disconnected. So it's either through working with a provider or looking, as I think as Virgin do, and David might clarify this, is they'll help customers connect their equipment. But yeah, we definitely need to close that gap.
And that pause, so because that's been quite some time now, I hadn't realized it was still in place. When is that likely, or what are the drivers that are going to change that? And will that impact the end date at all?
So definitely won't impact the end date. Obviously, it means that we've got to put a lot of resources behind it. We are still, sorry, just clarify, it's only our bulk migration process that is paused. We're still actively migrating customers to digital voice. And that includes all customers in the trial areas and customers on certain products that are being withdrawn, like FVA, which is fiber voice access. We've got a set of criteria internally that we need to meet to restart, and a lot of it is around the support for customers. Some of it's around internal processes and also around communication. So a lot of feedback from when we were doing migrations previously. All I can say, we're looking to restart around springtime this year, but we haven't yet confirmed an exact date.
Okay. David, any observations from your side?
Yeah, and as Sodhi said, the last thing anyone wants is to leave a customer exposed here. The policy that we adopt is for our engineers to assist customers as much as possible in reconnecting devices. So if it's a very simple plug and play device, it could be reconnected with the support of the engineer. Now, it's worth noting that there's ongoing work as an industry on this as well. So the organisation called the Office of Telecoms Adjudicator, or OTA, which effectively is Ofcom's man to get industry to agree things as a collective, is trying to get agreement on the day process. So what do engineers do, whether they come from Virgin, whether they come from TalkTalk, BT, whoever? And that is looking at, what's best practice. Should there be test calls involved? Simply pressing the button on the phone, speaking to the ARC, for example, before and after migrations. There's also some work that CPs who use the OpenReach network have been doing to ask for OpenReach processes to be updated, again aligned to that work. And I think all of that recognises the fact that this is very much an ongoing process. I think that the risk is our engineers are very, very experienced and familiar with telecoms kit, but of course they're not experienced with kit from an entirely different industry, the telecare industry. So what we need to do is have that cooperation be linked into local authorities, service providers where we're doing migrations, so that if anything does fall through the net, we can pick that up as quickly as possible on both sides as well. And I think that's really important, because we do know, people aren't perfect. Things can get overlooked. Alarms could be situated in a bedroom, and an engineer might be entirely unaware that a customer has an alarm. And it's how do we have those customers' interests protected as well. And I think that's where we do need that close liaison.
Is there an opportunity, just a daft idea off the top of my head, to have some stickers made to say this person has an emergency alarm, and get the telecare service providers to essentially issue those out and have them stuck next to the alarm, or next to the socket, the telephone socket, so that even if there's an alarm in the bedroom, the engineer can see straight away there's a yellow sticker or something to say, this person has an alarm. So perhaps it's something the industry, more the TSA stroke UK telehealthcare can consider with its members, to be able to have some simple system to flag this up. Because I've often thought myself, if an engineer comes in and says to an elderly person, do you have any telephones in the bedroom, that might go, no. So, that's fine, we can cut that off. if you said, do you have an emergency alarm in the bedroom? They might say, yes, absolutely. And I'm conscious that these alarm systems are not always in sight of the telephone socket, and particularly as the extensions are being cut off potentially, then yeah, that could lead to a problem. But maybe come to yourself. Sorry.
Good point. And we've heard of local authorities unilaterally putting stickers so that there are contact points. So if there's an issue, people have a point of access, or there is more awareness of that. So that's something that's certainly happening locally. But could that be scaled up? Could it be national? And could on our side, on the telco provider side, could we write something into that agreed protocol that supports all of that? And from a Virgin point of view, we've given our engineers big red cards to leave with every telecare customer to say, everything's fine from our perspective, your device has been reconnected, but you still need to contact your provider. Or if it's a hardwired connection that we can't touch on the day, this is an issue, you need to contact your provider even more urgently than the other card. But it's just that flagging it up in ways that can be understood by the demographic that we're talking about here, which lots of small print, lots of digital stuff isn't really going to cut the mustard.
No, quite. Certainly, as we've discussed in the past, one of the areas that really concerns me is there a danger of a service being migrated effectively by post? So a router is sent through the post to the resident is advised that a week on Monday the line will be migrated. You need to plug your router in and use a DECT phone with the router. Is there any danger of that happening, David, with a vulnerable elderly user that has got an emergency alarm device?
I think that's one we're very aware of, Steve. Yes. So it begs the question: how do you pre-identify those customers before you start a migration? So I know that the TSA and UK Telehealthcare have done a good job in terms of the ARC numbers being publicised to our industry, so we can do a pre-check of our customer calls and identify telecare users before the migration starts. And the other thing that we are doing, and has been really successful, is speaking with local authorities and trying to get a data share agreement with them so they can provide us with the telephone numbers of their service users. We can say, you've given us 2,000 telephone numbers. Of those 2,000, 500 are Virgin Media customers, so you can focus on those 500 for the migration. But also, if we haven't got any of those on our list, we can add them to our list, so they are then captured again. There's no silver bullet, but I think we want to make sure we are doing everything we can to get that pre-identification right, and then that removes that risk or minimizes that risk of just not being aware of somebody being in the vulnerable position.
No, thank you, and that's a good and responsible approach, David. And I assume the other CPs are doing the same. But rather than do too much round robin on this call, I'd like to bring Michael in, Michael Swarfield. Hopefully your connection's working okay, Michael, and you're on mute at the moment. But I know this is an area of interest to yourself, of how can we take whatever action to mitigate the risk of somebody ending up being disconnected unintentionally because of a lack of knowledge between the CP and the fact that a service user has an emergency alarm device.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. I work for the Department of Health, and I'm currently in a team in NHS England. It's a joint policy team in NHS England which looks at social care tech issues. I think quite a lot of the things that sort of David and Phil have said have sort of shown what is currently underway in terms of CPs trying to work out you know, the sort of on the day process, and where an engineer is coming to the house to sort of switch over somebody's telephone, and there's work, as sort of David has said, with the Office of the Telecom Adjudicator, which is looking really at what the sort of expectations are on alarm receiving centres and telecare service providers to be part of that process, and we're sort of also thinking about you know, what is the expectation on telecare service providers and their ability to respond when sort of information is sort of shared about movements over to digital. And Virgin, just before Christmas, released quite a lot of information about when they'd be switching over people across the country in terms of areas. And I know BT are sort of also thinking about how they move groups of people regionally going forward. So I think one of I think the sort of issue at the moment is the context, and I'd be, Steve, I'd be sort of interested to know if you know any more about where people at the moment are being left with no telecare service because they've migrated. You know, is that part of the fact that they have gone to a new telephone provider, or they have got a new sort of telephone and TV deal, and the person who switched them over hasn't been aware that that they sort of are a telecare user. I think that's important to know just at the moment. In terms of some of the work that I've been doing, both with panel members and wider, just before Christmas, we in the Department of Health issued a telecare stakeholder action plan, which is on gov.uk. If you just type in telecare stakeholder action plan, that sort of gives you some of the actions which we are working with both the telecare sector and the telecommunications sector over the coming weeks and months, and we'll be doing a update on that report in April. But I think that sort of looks at the wider issues about communication and coordination and some of the things that have been said already this morning, plus sort of some of the technical issues as well about the use of analog equipment on digital lines. I think we would all like to be going through the switchover with sort of, you know, a firm footing that sort of everything will be digital at the end of 2025. I think with something like, you know, 1.8 million telecare devices and probably lots of them still analog based. I tell you, there's a very real chance that quite a lot of analog equipment will sort of still be in use. And one of the things we're looking at the moment with the TSA is what sort of tests have been undertaken on analog equipment working on digital lines, and to try and analyze those and make those available, so that sort of some of the issues about reliability and mitigation can be explored much wider and in sort of straightforward on sort of technical language, so that sort of this, all people involved with telecare devices can sort of make a judgment about whether they sort of need to update some of their service users earlier in terms of their equipment than they might have been thinking in terms of their sort of overall upgrade in terms of equipment going forward. Sorry, I might have been rambling there, but I'd say please do look at the action plan, and also if you have some test results of analog on digital lines and you haven't shared those with the TSA, please just drop your name into the chat and I will follow up with you after the call.
Okay, thank you for that, Michael. I'd just like to bring Julia in for a moment. I think, Julia, you may have a question to ask on behalf of one of the delegates. Oh, are you there, Julia? Okay, we will leave that for a moment. John, as in John Livermore, I appreciate you being very patient. I presume you're still there and in audio contact.
I'm enjoying the ride, Steve.
Yeah, because normally I pick on you far more than this. So you have
this is a holiday for me. I'm fine. Keep going.
Good man. Couple of questions, but the first one, and the beauty of yourself is you can answer these quite broadly. I think it was David or a little while ago mentioned about extensions. Can you just clarify a couple of things? One is, if somebody's got an extension at the moment, the telecare devices in a bedroom, which is not that unusual because particularly if somebody's hard of hearing, it might be in a specific geographic location. And as you appreciate, normally the telecom socket is by the front door, the nearest point to the cable coming in. So that's one question. Are there any options around that at all? And the second one is, again, I think it might have been Phil mentioned about backing up not just the router, but the fiber termination unit as well. And I'm not sure everybody is clear, and I'll be honest, I'm not 100% clear of what hardware is actually going into somebody's property upon digitalization. Am I right in thinking that in some cases it is effectively just a router, but if there's a fiber coming in, there's an additional device as well? So two separate questions, if you could possibly pick up on those, John.
I'll try and unpack, I think about 7 different questions in there, but I'll try and get down to the two that I think you're after, Steve. You do like your pound of flesh. So let's just get a couple of basics, I suppose. Is just remember that the migration starts with the CP, the communication provider telephone company, the guys on here, but many other 690 out there, remember? So we've got here, we're very fortunate, we've got TalkTalk, we've also got BT here, of course, Virgin, different network to us all together, but we work collaboratively. But of course, there are 690, so your Vodafone, the phones, your Sky, just on and on, this goes on. And every one of those will contact your clients when they are ready to do it. And that could be years apart. And we know it's got to happen in the next 3 years. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you've got to ask yourself a question, which is, what is going into that premises? So the customer is going to either be referred to fiber to the premises, so full fiber, end-to-end fiber, or they're going to end up with part fiber, so fiber to the cabinet, which the industry knows as SOGEA for those that are switched on and those kind of things. If outside your client's front door is going to be fiber to the premises, they will need an engineering visit, and Openreach will be effectively a supplier to the CP, so the communications provider, will ask us to go to the premises and fit, I'm going to find my box, one of these things, which is known as an ONT, or an optical network terminal. That is a light box. Put simply, you've got a glass line end to end for fiber to the premises. It's made of glass and light goes up and down it. You need to send light up, you need to get light down again. This goes into your premises. It does need a 3-pin plug on the end of it. Therefore, if you have no power in your premises because of power cut, it stops working, you have no service. So that's the first thing to remember. If you then plug a router in, which you do because otherwise, what else do you need? The router also needs to have power. So effectively, if you are going to full fiber, your clients are going to full fiber, they're going to need a power backup for both of those. Openreach supply neither of those. It's down to the communications provider to be able to provide that if they want to. There is no obligation for them to do so. As Phil said earlier, the obligation, and I did put it in the chat earlier, the Ofcom document from 2018 says that an at-risk customer, I don't think it defines exactly what that means, I think that's open to interpretation, must be able to phone 999 for a period of 1 hour after a power cut situation. If the power cut's at 2 in the morning and you are fast asleep, your hour disappears by 3 o'clock in the morning. So therefore, you can't suddenly think, oh, it'd be nice and convenient. It means the obligation on the service provider, the telephone company, is to make sure that you can ring that 999 call for at least 1 hour. Now, the way of doing that is twofold. You can either provide a battery backup unit, and that is something that will either be free or it'll be at cost depending on the customer situation. And the alternative is a mobile phone. So some communications providers are not going down the battery backup route. They are saying, if you've got a mobile phone, then that's it. That's how you phone 999, which raises the question, which is, which phone number is registered with your telephone company? Now, if you are Fred Bloggs, you're 92 years old, and you told at some point your phone company you've got a mobile phone, but that phone sits in your drawer in the kitchen because it was given to you by your grandson because he didn't want it anymore. It's his old iPhone 4 or something. It's never been plugged in. If that's what they've got on their record, that's how they're expecting you to phone 999. So that's a word to the wise. In terms of extensions, of course, disappear the day that you are migrated over. So when your communications provider gives you the date, possibly the time, probably not, but they'll give you a date to say this is your day. If they provide you for a router, because as David talked about Solus voice customers, that's anybody really that hasn't got a router. So if today you've got a telephone line used for voice, haven't got a router, that's what they call Solus. But effectively, that's a technical jargon. No one needs to know. That's not any importance. The issue is that to continue any kind of service, the communication provider must provide you with a router, even for voice, and somebody's got to plug that in. Now, where does it go? It goes into the master socket. Does the individual know which is their master socket? Hopefully, it'll be the one by the door. Who knows? Depends on the premises. It could be the one under the stairs. It could be the one hidden in the cupboard because someone's run an extension. It could be your brother-in-law, Bob, that ran out 5 extensions for you 10 years ago. So the wiring of the extensions may also be an issue for you, because if you're trying to do anything, we talked the other day about voice reinjection and the possibility that some communication providers are toying with the idea of this thing called VRI, or voice reinjection. The idea is that some may provide you with a lead which can plug into the back of their router, and that lead will plug into a front plate. Again, it has to be ordered. OpenReach have to turn up and change the front plate of the master socket. If you connect that front plate to the back of the router by lead provided by the telephone company, you may get your extensions working again. Depends on what quality the wiring is, who did it, all that kind of stuff. Telecare we talk about almost incessantly, but actually it could be some without telecare. They've got the phone by the side of the bed. That's all they use. That's their way of communicating an emergency. On the day they're migrated, they will lose access to every single socket in that premises other than their master socket. The master socket will have to have a router put in. My concern is not just about the engineer. We talked a lot about engineers turning up and engineers spotting stuff, and maybe it's by the bed, don't spot it. Remember, the majority of us in the UK are going to be transferred, migrated to fibre to the cabinet, because that's what's sitting outside our doors now. Those that are lucky enough to fibre to the premises, I'm at 9 million, I think at the moment, 10 million premises have that. But the majority, I'm up in Norfolk, I will be over on fibre to the cabinet, as most of my neighbours and most of the county will be. That doesn't need an engineering visit. If my communications provider has not got a clue that I've got a telecare device, there's no reason for them to think that I need a special visit. Therefore, the first that I will know is when I get a letter or communications from my telephone company telling me the date of migration. On that day, everything in my home ceases to work other than my broadband router in my master socket. If I haven't plugged it in, if it's not connected, if it's got no power, no one's going to come to my door. No one's going to knock on my door. No one's going to check on me. I would just stop working. And that's something to remember. Is that okay, Steve? Has that covered most of your questions?
That's really helpful, John. Just an observation from myself. I know manufacturers of alarm devices have been doing a lot of testing of the legacy analog devices, plugging them into routers, and clearly there are test centers set up with OpenReach and Virgin and others. I'm not quite sure how that testing is going, and feel free to give an observation, John. But the point I was just about to make is it's almost a cautionary question from myself, which is, if there are circa 650 CPs in the UK, then you may well test a device and go, okay, it's fine on just pick a CP at random. It's fine on a BT circuit, and my alarm system works from one manufacturer's alarm to the same manufacturer's call center via that BT connection. But of course, once you've tested that and said, yeah, that's fine, walk out the door, there's nothing to stop that service provider in 6 months' time wanting a better deal and realizing, another CP, Joe Bloggs, one of the 650, in actually transferring that service. So is it fair to say if you transfer the service, it may end up with that service provider may end up with a different router, and that router may not necessarily provide the security of connection that the first router and the first service provider did?
You're absolutely right. And what I would say is that I think most of them, I've heard me say this before, OpenReach absolutely do not recommend the use of ATA ports in the back of routers for life critical equipment. I've run the lab for OpenReach now for over a year. I've had 34 different days in there. I've had 24 different companies. To say that the results in ATA is variable is an understatement. I don't think I've seen anybody walk out with every single CP's equipment working in tandem. I've seen people stand there almost in tears saying, well, why does it work in this one and not in that one? There are so many variables you've got to take into account. The quality of the ATA port in the back of it. You've got to take into account the VoIP service. You've got to remember that this VoIP service that everyone's trying to use for the ATA port is a voice service. It's called voice over IP. Telecare devices send tones, DTMF digits, and they get elongated, they get shortened. As you've heard people, I think, in the industry before say, it's like a piano. You play the piano beautifully and you understand it. Someone else plays it, you kind of understand the tune, but it's not quite right. Machines don't like that. Machines like to hear it. So what you end up with is the Telecare device sending a string of digits. They connect to the call center, and then the call center comes back and says, are you there? Can you give me your codes, your digits? It sends it, and you set up with two machines shouting at each other. I've seen people where it's worked first time and not second time, third time but not fourth time. It really is not a great solution. I guess the other thing to mention as well is people keep going on, I suppose, about CPs and about OpenReach and stuff like that. And it's all right. You know, we were in this together. The telecare industry has known about this since 2017. I've been standing on platforms when I had my previous job since 2017 saying we've got to move to IP. If you leave it and you leave it, you leave it, this is where we're going to end up. And we've been hearing a lot of very, very big telecare companies for some time carrying on selling these analog equipment, saying stick it in the back of the router. It's all a storm and a teacup. And now kind of our chickens have come home. Can I just, one quick thing I'd like to mention, that just that David, I think Cross has put down here, a question about stop sell. I just want to address that very quickly because people keep talking to me about stop sell. I just want a quick clarification. When it comes to the switch off of the PSTN or WLR as we know it, that is the end of 2025. There is a stop sell list out, and that talks about exchanges that have a lot of fibre to their premises in them. Those exchanges are still 2025. If you see an exchange on there that you think is in your area, that makes no difference to you. Don't get hung up on the fact that suddenly you've got to do something quicker. You haven't. Yeah. It's actually advisory to the CPs to say, this is where all the fibre is being built. That's really what you've got to migrate over to. But don't get hung up on it, please. It's not, and it's not, it's our fault as much as anything else. It's become very complex. Don't get hung up on stop sell. Think of 2025. So
the stop sell is really saying you can't commission a brand new analog service, but don't think the old one's going to be switched off at this stage.
Yeah, if you think about this, back in 2018 when the document went out from Ofcom, from BT Group, everyone would have liked to stop selling the analog lines immediately, because every new one you take on makes the problem bigger, because every new one you go on, you've got to take off by 2025. But because we had to give 5 years notice, that's why 2023 became the date, September 2023. So today, if you are in a non-stop sell area, you could take thousands and thousands of legacy lines, put them all in, and they're still going to have to be migrated. Every day we go through this, we're making the problem bigger. So all stop sell is really saying is at last we can stop selling the problem because it's getting bigger. The stop sell list was where we had dispensation from Ofcom to basically say, because there's so much fibre there, they let us go a bit earlier with that. But even then, we had to give a year's notice.
I'll come to you in a second, Phil. I can see your hand up. But John, you and I have known each other for donkey's years now. And I'm sure it was before 2017, you and I were talking about the digitalization process and the need to raise awareness. And I know you've done a fantastic job over the years of banging that drum. But, at the risk of being slightly political, do a sense there's a slight change in your tone and you're becoming a little bit frustrated now with how...
No, not really. I think the problem is that it's very complex. It's incredibly complex. And if you think about it, we all sit in our bit of it. None of us, as David said earlier, there is no silver bullet. We can't all fix it. Yeah. You think about it, OpenReach have got the bit between the exchange and the premises. BT Group own the exchange. The communication provider take it from the master socket to the router effectively. And then the telecare world and the alarm industry and faxes and phones and that whole hardware thing have got to plug into that. And nobody particularly out there has turned around and said, oh, I really like you to give me this problem. The problem came because we've got an aging network. In 2018, when BT Group went off to Ofcom, they said, this kit's 30, 40 years old. The System X that was put in the 80s, which was digital, of course, ironically, we keep talking about digital, is dying on its feet because the companies that make it have gone out of business years ago. People like GC Plessy have not been around for 20 years. Engineers are coming to the end of their working life. Some engineers have spent their whole life maintaining this equipment. But most of us, 40 years is it. So that's what this is all about. And the problem is, you give 7 years, you give 2 years, you give what's the right notice to give? That's the problem. Very often, people, you talk to them and say, you got 7 years. They go, hang on a minute, I've got 5 different jobs by then. Why should I care about it? We're now in a kind of a 3-year thing. And there are still people I spoke to a year ago in local authorities and so on who've changed job. And you're trying to find the same people over and over again. So it's not so much, I guess, a frustration. It's more the fact that if this frightens me, it really does. And Sarah knows this, we talked about this the other day. This is the one that keeps me awake at night. There is 95% of people in the UK will love faster broadband. It's all going to be fantastic. Telecare is a life-saving piece of equipment. We can't afford to get it wrong, but all of us, unfortunately, only own a bit of the supply chain, and nobody owns all of it. So I think there's no one on this call that doesn't want it to be fixed. None of us that actually don't want it to work. All of us worry about people losing their lives. It's just no simple way of making it happen other than to say to the telecare industry, folks, you've got to take responsibility as well. And in fact, let me just make this one final point, if I may, Steve. If you say today on this call, who are the people that actually know who the clients are, what their phone numbers are, where they live, it's actually the folks in the alarm receiving centres. They know where they are. And that probably, arguably, when you talk about stickers and all that kind of stuff, it really probably should start with the telecare industry knowing who their customers are, letting them know to contact their friends, their neighbours, their carers to say, look, this is coming. We want to support you through it. And some have done that, some haven't done that.
Great observations, as always, John, and thank you for that. Phil, I think you had your hand up on that one. Oh, you're still on mute. That's it.
Yeah. Hiya. Yeah, 2 things. Firstly, just to your point about tests, being on the day, if you like, there's no guarantee it'll work the next day. I absolutely understand that. But I wanted to go back to the scenario you mentioned earlier about a customer who's with BT, has a BT router, and then perhaps moves to another CP and gets a different router. It's not even the router. It's the fact that if you move from let's say if you move from TalkTalk to Sky, for example, the likelihood is that fiber connection is going to be via OpenReach. So it's the same piece of cable, but the network that runs on that cable could well be configured differently between CP and CP. So it isn't. There's no guarantees, and that's why I'm really keen. I look after our lab up in near Manchester. That's why I'm really keen to get more people to come in and test their equipment, even though they might say they've tested it on BT's. I want them to come into our lab and test that on ours as well. And whilst, as you say, there's no guarantee, there's never a guarantee that anything will work. But the more testing we can do, the safer we will probably feel in when we're migrating these people. So for me, a bit of an appeal really. If anybody uses any particular manufacturer, ask them if they've tested equipment, ask them where they've tested it, and if they say, oh, I've been to OpenReach or I've been to TalkTalk, say to them, well, you need to go to these other ones as well, because I think it's really, really important that we build up a database. And as I think Michael suggested earlier, one of the bits that's missing out of that is probably the results. I went to such and such a lab, and here's the results. Again, I think that's down to the manufacturers provide them, not to the CP. But if we can start building up a bit of a database, then hopefully, if somebody's going to use router XYZ, they can go onto this database, see how it's performed on BT, see how it's performed on TalkTalk, etc. And it'll hopefully just give people a bit more confidence that it is going to work, or that it isn't going to work. and we need to move to a different solution. So
a couple of observations from myself. It's interesting. There seems to be this level of, confidentiality around results from testing. And I would love a much more open approach from both the manufacturers and service providers who are often doing their own testing. And, at the end of the day, we're all trying to save people's lives. Nobody wants to have a life lost because a system didn't work in an emergency. And I'm not sure the mechanism by which we could pull it all together as a sector. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a common database that we know X product on an X service to an X call center platform has a 99% credibility or reliability, whereas a completely different combination has a high failure rate and they should be avoided. And I fully understand manufacturers want to protect their customer base. They want to obviously promote their own products, etc. But I think there is a higher duty of care as well. And I know from, and I won't mention names, it's not appropriate, but certainly one service provider I've been talking to who've been doing testing down with John's OpenReach Labs. The testing is very, very varied. It literally went from 100% yes works with one set of equipment with one router through to their call center to 100% failure with a different provider with a different router through to the same call center. And we shouldn't forget, if you've got, as an industry, even if you just pick a figure of 10 different alarm devices out there, but going via 650 CPs, what's that, about 65,000? Going to 4 or 5 different call center platforms, some of which are being tested with SIP trunks, some have got ISDN connectivity, some have got analog lines, then the variables to actually say, oh no, I know under every circumstance this device will work safely, are just almost astronomical. I guess it's probably more than 100,000 permutations you could come up with. And the factor is that whilst the supply of the alarm device is in the control of the service provider and to some degree the call center platform, although they may be getting third parties to do that monitoring for them, but with a potential change of CP because of the service user deciding to change from Now to Sky or whatever it may be, does bring an element of risk into the equation. I would like to broaden this out a little bit because I'm very conscious we've spent quite a long while, as part of an hour, getting input from the CPs, and that's very appropriate. But I'd like to pull some other people in. And Richard, if I may pull you into this from Farpoint, you've been very patiently listening to what's being said. In terms of that broader picture of where we are as an industry, your observations as a consultancy about how service providers are progressing to ensure we all have a safe service beyond 2025. What observations have you got?
Yeah, so we've obviously kind of spent a lot of time, understandably, kind of talking around the detail of the digital shift, and what the 600 and odd telecoms companies are planning to do around rolling out these digital lines. And I think there's an awful lot of detail there. We've heard a lot of acronyms this morning. We've heard a lot of detail, and I think generally people are struggling with this, struggling to get an overall picture of what's going to happen and when are you going to see your service users start to be moved across to digital lines. And I think I would cut through a lot of that detail, and I think John summed it up very clearly a few minutes ago with just remembering that the overall recommendation is that we don't plug analog telecare kit into digital phone lines, because they cannot be relied on for all the kind of technical reasons that we've been talking about this morning. So in terms of what we're seeing in the industry, people are struggling with this. They are trying to pull together their plans. We're seeing more and more people going out and testing the market and starting procurements in order to put new digital ARC services in place, call handling services, and are looking at the options around what equipment that they should be buying. Can they get hold of it? I've seen a few comments in the chat around timescales, and yes, that is a big issue. We're hearing some of the big manufacturers quoting kind of 9-10 month lead times and things like that. So it does raise into question what can we do by 2025? Is 2025 realistic to get everyone shifted across? So on that, I think there really needs to be kind of two streams of work that providers are looking at. First is just understanding what the impact of the digital shift is on their existing services, and that's touching on some of the points you were raising a minute ago, Steve, about being a lot more open, manufacturers being a lot more open about how reliable the kit that they've been selling to providers for the last 20 years is going to operate when connected to the digital line. So we understand what the short-term risk is to service users, and we can manage that risk. And in parallel with that, have a program of work in place to actually start putting a digital telecare service in place in each of the areas, in order that you've got something that you can start moving people across to, after looking at things like prioritizing service users based on the reliability of their existing kit and their level of vulnerability and care needs and things like that, so we can start to move people across like that.
Yeah, I do fear that we will be very quickly moving into the area of mitigation rather than absolute solution. And I just picking up on your point, Richard, I have a sort of ongoing dialogue with various system and platform providers. And you're right, we should recognize as an industry, there is a worldwide shortage of certain electronic components. Whether it be a microprocessor or a crystal oscillator, some of these things are now in 2-year lead times. That bumps us into 2025 before some of the components will be available. And therefore, it's not just a will and a funding, it's actually a physical capacity now. And I think we're just about run out of time. That, can the industry, even if we all wanted to move to a fully digital service, does the industry actually have the capacity and time to actually generate the technology that we need to move forward? And even if they could, where would the funding come from? So being a little bit fatalist, I fear we've already, as an industry, perhaps missed the boat for 2025. And the hard truth is there's still going to be an awful lot of analog equipment out there. And therefore, coming back to the point of mitigation, how do we ensure that it has the highest probability of working successfully in the event of an emergency with a service user? And I think over the next year or so, our focus is probably going to have to switch more in that direction. But a lot of this is to do with communication. I'll just give you Sarah, this question is coming in your direction. So as an industry, how are we raising awareness? I'd be very disappointed if a provider of telecare services is not pretty aware of what's going on. But it obviously helps if next of kin of elderly people with alarm devices are also, understanding what's happening, as well as the broader sector. And of course, we shouldn't forget, we're very much focused upon telecare, telehealth, but there are a heck of a lot more devices using the current analog network, intrude alarm systems, CCTV, access control, than just ourselves. So, Sarah, perhaps you can give a view on what's happening in terms of communications.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and it's great to be back at this event. So one of the things that has been recognised by the communication providers and Openreach is that there is times when working together as an industry and speaking with one voice kind of is beneficial and adding value. And that could be communicating with sectors such as telecare and then health and social care, and all the other industries, because there is no vertical that's going to be left untouched by this migration. And whilst for many consumers, it will be a very simple transition, It's just the technology underlying the delivery of that landline that's changing, and many don't even use their landline anymore, and many will be upgraded to fiber. There is that small subset in the consumer world of the more vulnerable that we are concerned about. And that is something there are concerns in other industry sectors. So I sit within Tech UK, which is a trade association representing the tech sector. And I work with the different work programs to raise awareness in the sectors that they work for. So, for example, we've done briefings with the utilities, with the water sector. We speak to the finance sector. We have an event coming up with the transport in next month. And it's looking at kind of raising awareness and understanding what the impact might be on those sectors. For those that aren't yet prepared, a bit of a call to action to audit what the lines are being used for. So that's been going on, and that's where industry working together is adding value. I think one of the things in this particular space is there's been a fair amount of research looking at consumer awareness, the general levels of awareness in the UK of the digital phone switchover, and where that level of awareness is. What would be interesting to see is actually what the level of awareness is for the customers of telecare devices, and what the telecare sector has been doing in communicating that this is coming, because they know who their customers are. While CPs and Openreach can do all kinds of things that might identify the customers, it's not a guarantee that we will find every single person out there. So it'd be interesting, it might be one for you, Richard, Max, to look at, the telecare users themselves. Are they aware? Is their support network aware that is coming? And what could be done? I know that that's just one step of it, but anything that's increasing the readiness of the supply chain of those special services, so that when it comes time to migrate a customer, it is a much smoother, seamless, more pleasant experience for the customer, because everything else is in place, would be what we'd like to see.
Okay, thank you. Could I bring in Gilles from DCMS? Again, just moving away from the CPs of our conversation at the moment. Gilles, what observations have you got about, almost the lack of mandatory requirement to provide things like an extended backup, and the area of communication and making people aware of what's going on and what they're entitled to get?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everyone. So taking your questions in turn, Steve, starting maybe with talking about power resilience and the requirements within that, and then moving on to communication, which is a topical subject that we speak continuously with communications providers about as well. On resilience, we've had a fair bit of discussion already about Ofcom's general requirements to ensure that people can phone 999. We're in continuous discussions with Ofcom about how we just monitor to what extent people meet those requirements. We are also discussing with our friends over at BASE and at Ofgem to try and get a bit more detail around just resilience in the round. We've talked about, for example, mobile phones being one way in which people rely on other communications network in the event that VoIP-powered landlines go down. So we're also looking into things like, what does our mobile resilience look like as well? That is an ongoing work that we're doing with a wide variety of stakeholders within government. So it is obviously a key issue. It's I was going to say a hard fork, which is a bit harsh, but it is clearly a meaningful difference between a PSTN-powered network and a VoIP-powered network, that resilience becomes ever more important in that space. So we are continuing to do work on that and talking to communication providers as well, making sure that they're aware, making sure that they're following the existing guidelines set by Ofcom, and also following with interest the things that David and co talked about earlier, that obviously the guidelines are a minimum, like it's a floor, not a ceiling. And so in any other thing that we can do to encourage providers to make sure that their own battery solutions or backup solutions are as powerful as possible, is something we're very happy to support. On communications, and I should say that this is, I should set out what DCMS considers to be our role in this. Obviously, like Sarah already said, there's no individual sector that's not touched. And obviously, those remits, just from a government point of view, split between a huge number of departments. So our role is to do that level of awareness raising within the public sector. So we have several calls a week, really, with stakeholders from other departments, from other arm's length bodies, from other publicly funded bodies, to make sure that they're aware, to make sure that we can, for example, get news out from newsletters or other communications channels that's owned by the other departments. So For example, we've been working at Carbo with DEFRA to make sure that the stakeholders in water, for example, get information from the government saying, are you aware of the PSTN migration? That's obviously moving a fair bit away from telecare, but we're doing similar things, working fairly closely with Michael Spofield and co in the telecare space as well. We do recognize that a base level of awareness among just end consumers is probably a good thing. Exactly how to do that is a matter of ongoing discussion between ourselves, Ofcom, and the communications providers. I do agree with what was said earlier that I think joint working here is best, and any way in which the government can amplify messages coming out of communications providers, we're very happy to do so. For example, we've recently launched a web page on gov.uk that sets out base level information about the PSTN migration and then links to more information that can come from Ofcom or from some of the major communications providers. Obviously, that doesn't answer any of the more technical questions that we've discussed so far, but we do think it's probably a net good thing if a relative or a neighbor or a friend of someone who is a vulnerable consumer and may rely on, for example, their telecare provision, if they're aware and they can at least have words with the vulnerable consumers in question saying, are you aware of this and have you spoken to your communications provider and your telecare provider? We think that base level of awareness can be an important tool to have to aid this migration and make it as smooth as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Mark, I'd like to turn to yourself. Last but very much not least, Mark. I know you had a fairly short response to the question of funding earlier, and we've talked about some of the technology challenges, but I think one of the things that potentially is slowing down the migration is the cost involved. And Alistair, who's online, has asked the question: could the government fund the one-off cost of transformation to digital to minimise the impact? The risk is end users can't afford the digital transformation, which results in them being unsubscribing from valuable services and putting more demand upon the NHS. And if I may sort of preface this, I remember back in the day, probably, I guess, 15, 20 years ago, I'm sure plenty of people online will remember it better than I, the government launched their PCT grant, a preventative technology grant. And that was 120 million pound of spend over a 2-year period to kickstart, not digitalization, but literally kickstart the broader use of care technology to help in terms of social care and healthcare. I think we're all appreciating that the government is pretty strapped for cash at the moment, but is there a recognition in government as to the pickle this sector is getting itself into and the potential consequences? And just as a second part to that is, telecare alarm devices traditionally fall into two categories: those that we class as broadly individual alarm devices, dispersed alarm units, where you have one physical device for one service user in one property, unlinked to other residents. And then within sheltered housing, you traditionally have what we categorize as group systems, where there is a central control unit and slightly lower level intelligent intercoms linked back to that central control unit. And the calculation I've always broadly given people is roughly 1 million of individual alarm devices in the UK, and perhaps 800,000 alarm devices within sheltered housing, the intercoms. One of the concerns I've got is the lack of progress housing associations are making in upgrading the group systems to digital, as opposed to the fairly continuous stream of changes taking place within dispersed alarm units. So this is an issue relating, I guess, to housing associations and those local authorities that are still running their own housing stock. And again, the cost potentially implications of upgrading sheltered schemes arguably is much more significant. That's going to run into, I would suggest, hundreds of millions if you're going to swap equipment out. And more people are more easily put at risk with a old, faulty analog connection. It's 40 or 50 people at risk rather than one. So sorry, Mark, I've made that complicated. So two parts of the question. One is, surely the government can provide some funding, or the local authorities can provide some funding to allocate to this area. And then a more specific question around sheltered housing and perhaps the lack of focus within that area.
Thanks ever so much. Now I've got all that. Hi everyone, Mark Williams, I'm one of the advisors in the Local Government Association. Yeah, absolutely. We would really would welcome the funding to be able to look at these. I think looking at the logistics of it as well, so just trying to focus how we would be able to go about that should the funding become available. So there's lots of cogs in the chains, especially when we look at health and social care systems. We look at all the different compatibility across all platforms. So is this particular device compatible with this platform, so on and so forth? Then does that link in with your social care system or your staff planning and rostering sort of systems? And then it's looking at the devices at the homes as well. So we mentioned around telecare devices. So we've got the individual alarms, and then we've also got the sheltered housing schemes as well. Now, one of the concerns within the sheltered housing schemes at the moment is the infrastructure that's hardwired into the homes. So if we think of the old cord chains in the bathrooms, for example, or around the house, what is the wiring that's actually in the walls that feeds through to the telephone socket? Will that need to be upgraded? So there's a lot more cost and practical development which needs to be done rather than just replacing a box. It might need replastering the whole walls when you start tearing the wires out to make it compatible. So these things would need to be thought about as well, or if there is a solution out there. And I think it goes back to really good example of what is out there at the market at the moment. There's a lot of devices out there which you can buy off the shelf, which just work. They're just compatible with other devices. If we think of your smart devices at home, like the Amazon boxes, you can buy smart plugs, you can buy light bulbs, sensors, everything, and they just work out the box. And I think that's a real opportunity for the sector to think about, could we create devices going forward that just work with these different platforms? So, you've got like the Amazon platform, you've got a Google platform and stuff. And likewise in the telecare sector, we've got X, Y, and Z. I won't say the names on there. And it's a way of that this one device could work with them platforms. And what local authorities are starting to find now and starting to explore is looking at sorry, I've lost my train of thought on this one there. So how going forward, you could use with sort of the data sharing as well. So the data intelligence, which we use with our own platforms, is really useful. We're able to identify trends, patterns, help develop the service, and help prevent accidents going into A&E, for example. We're able to do a lot more preventative work when we've got the data. And it's making sure that these platforms which are being created going forward, the local authority or the care association or the actual who's actually using that service is able to access that data, able to map it in with what's already there as well. And I think that's definitely something we need to consider when we do talk about the fundings and the one-off cost as well. It's making sure it is all compatible on there as well. I hope that explains it in a bit there. I hope it's a bit brief enough for you, Steve. I'm happy to come back, elaborate a bit further or anything on that.
No, that's helpful. Although, do you think there's any possibility that the government could be lobbied for funding for this, Mark, in a replication of the PC, the Preventive Technology Grant?
It is something we are working with in terms of the lobbying side of things, making sure that there is funding for these opportunities, looking at the innovation and the discovery phases, just have a look to see what is out there. Regionally and locally, there is a lot of good practice which is happening out there as well. One of the things we are doing is we're trying to capture all this, what's happening across the regions, and making sure we do share it with all local authorities. We've recently just created a switchover forum for local authorities where they can share best practice, ask questions and answers, share what is just out there, what works, what don't work on there as well. It is early days with this though, but this is something we really do want to expand on, and then that can help shape any lobbying work or any of the future policies which we will push for.
Okay, thank you. Somebody asked a question online about sort of digital devices and all the more complex, etc. A very, very quick anecdote. A couple of weeks ago, an elderly neighbour fell and was left on the floor for a few hours. She wasn't provided with any form of alarm. And when I found out, I had a chat with them. I said, really, you should get one of these alarm devices. So she asked me who would recommend. So I give 2 or 3 companies, national organizations, and her son subsequently commissioned one of these alarm devices. And bless my good deed sort of backfired, because she turned up on my doorstep 2 or 3 nights ago with a box of bits and said, "Oh, can you help me get this going?" So I thought, I'd scratch my head. So I pulled this digital device out of the box. Being an old engineer, of course, in the blog, I completely ignored the instructions. I thought I've got to be able to figure this out. There's a power supply, one socket in the back of this thing, which the power supply obviously fitted. So I plugged it all in. The device woke up and said, "Oh, hi, I see you're commissioning a new system. Let me just check the pendant. So can you please go to 3 or 4 locations within the property and press the pendant?" So I'll follow instructions, and I did. It says, "Oh, that's fine. That's tested the device. It's all connected. Please put an emergency call on just to let the operator know the system's live," which I did. The operator answered it straight away. Simple as anything. Instant communications, fantastic speech quality. Obviously, it was wireless, so it literally just plugged into the mains. So from my own personal experience of how difficult it is to commission a digital device, in this case, it was absolutely very, very simple. Anyway, it's not about me telling anecdotes. It's about getting all the knowledge out of this fantastic panel we have. Coming back to yourself, John, I'm slowly getting back on track in the questions that people have asked. And this is a question from Mark Letters at Malthouse Security. We have several sites in Mildenhall, an area that is due to be turned off in 2023. Are manufacturers and control centres talking to each other? Is Mildenhall one of the earlier sites, John?
It is, and I know Mark well. Mark's been in the lab, and in fact, Mark's coming down next month again to the lab. So I think Mark's concern, if I don't want to speak for him, is that he raised a very good point, which is when Mark came into the lab before Christmas, there are still interconnect issues in the telecare world. I won't call out which companies, it wouldn't be fair, but there are companies at the moment. So you've got a call center organization, shall we say, Analogue. You've got the software, in terms of the various kind of packages, and also you've got the device. And in Mark's case, they are 3 different organizations, and they have been telling him for a while they have interconnect problems on the devices that he will resolve. And therefore, the day they had in the lab proved that the devices he's got in Mildenhall, which actually moves from PSTN in April this year, because they're on the test site. So in April this year, Mark has now got 2 months to change out all of his flagship sponsored equipment in all of his care homes in a couple of months. And I believe, and Mark will tell me I'm wrong, he's still waiting. At the end of this month, they've told him, before those 3 companies can resolve the issues they've got between themselves in terms of the interconnect between the ARC, the hardware, and the software. And that is of great concern. But that is all in effectively the telecare world. And in fact, again, for Mark, because I knew most of the people concerned, the companies, I kind of got them to all speak to each other. And I know that Mark actually chased him up again this week and has been told you'd have to wait until the end of the month, which is still another week away. So yeah, there are issues out there, it would seem, where when it comes to moving to IP, some software does not talk to the hardware, which doesn't therefore go through to the ARC when there are 3 different companies involved, which is not unusual.
Okay, thank you. Change of tact. Michael, I'd like to bring you back in on this one. Do the NHS see a bigger role for digital technology-enabled care to support the challenge around delayed transfer of care? And if so, where's the funding likely to come from?
Thanks, Steve. And in sort of terms of the funding, and not to be seen as flippant or anything like that, but the funding is out there. It's with local authorities, with integrated care systems. It's with the NHS, and it's about prioritising that sort of funding locally for sort of services like telecare, and services are making those sort of cases now and moving forward, because they're making the case that sort of telecare is sort of keeping people out of hospital, it's keeping people out of mainstream social care, it's sort of providing independence, it's it's sort of cutting down on sort of home social care visits, etc., and it's keeping people safe. And I think the sort of digital switchover, as it moves forward, will sort of allow much more personalized types of telecare services and services with greater use of sensors and the data collection, which can only help people who are using it. I think there's a way to go, though. I think that what I'd say. I think my focus, I think, with most people on the panel, is around how do we get through the next couple of years? How do people make that transition? And I think some of the anecdotal information coming back is that people might be replacing what they have now in terms of an analog sense with a like-for-like digital piece of kit, and will be paying more for that. And I think that's a sort of a process to go through with suppliers of information of sort of telecare devices. What does this give me over the next 5 years? What are the advantages? I don't want based on the money and resources that might be available, not to get locked into a contract that will just give a like-for-like service, but at a much more expensive rate. And I think so. I mean, my answer would be yes. I think that's there's a lot of thinking going on about different types of tech, especially on areas like falls and what have you, and that will all be coming on stream. But I think at the moment, my focus would be on getting through the next 2 years, but sort of not seeing people thinking they've got a really good digital deal when in fact it proves that they've just replaced what they have with something similar, but are paying more for it.
Just strike me, one of the the advantages, there are many advantages with digital devices, but certainly one of them is the ability to actually, especially if it's wireless, to take it home and plug it into the mains and have it working straight away. So from a hospital discharge, supporting delayed transfer of care, you've got a great solution that you could almost bundle a patient back home with a box of technology that is instantly working, and doesn't have to be separately commissioned, etc. But as you say, that's one very much for the future. Richard, can I bring you in on that one?
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to follow up on the point that Michael was making there, which I think is an important one. That we are seeing a number of providers looking at the move to digital as a like-for-like shift, and we are seeing some looking for it as an opportunity to broaden their service offering, transform, closer integration, etc., etc. And both of those approaches are equally valid, and obviously it's down to the organization to decide which one's right for them. But picking up on Michael's point, I think it's important that providers push back on some of their technology suppliers a bit, because I think there's an awful lot of digital wash around the market at the moment, a lot of mixed messaging, and I think mixed messaging is maybe being a little bit polite, but you hear a lot about people throwing digital around as a term, and there seems to be an assumption that the very fact that something is digital means that it's automatically better than what you've got now, and it's smart, and it's going to enable you to do all these analytics and things like that. And I think if you look at the reality of some of the solutions that are on offer in the market at the moment, that's just not the case. Yes, they're digital, but if you actually lift the hood a little bit and look what they can do, I think the service doesn't look hugely different to what people have just now. So yes, they're always on, and yes, you have some more visibility of whether the alarm is connected, which is a valuable thing to have. But apart from that, they don't look massively different in terms of what you're offering to the service user. So I think providers do need to be careful that they're not buying into some of this kind of digital wash that's been thrown around, and do challenge their suppliers and say what does this actually deliver, the benefits to you as a telecare provider and to service users, and don't just believe the kind of the vague statements about analytics and data being great and things like that. You know, you really should just say, show me this working, show me how this is going to deliver benefits, because we don't want people to be spending what is an awful lot of money to upgrade their kit to basically stand still, unless that's what they're going in there actively to do.
Okay, thank you. John, I think you got an observation.
Yeah, I think Richard's made a fantastic point, which is that we do get very much hung up on all the negatives. This is a challenge, this is a problem, this is what, and it's true, it is a challenge. However, what we should be thinking as well is the benefits that having faster broadband and that kind of speed, you know, the big kind of the nirvana we've always gone for is, you know, the NHS being able to examine you in your homes and all that kind of stuff, the biometrics, the telehealth side of it. And it's always been limited by things like bandwidth. If this is embraced, rather than seeing it's just a problem, and that's not for us to do. We can say there's a network, it'll be faster, be quicker, it'll be more resilient. But ultimately, Richard's absolutely right. This is now the so-called Internet of Things that all of us don't know what that actually means because we've heard it so many times. But what is that? That's a £3,000 fridge that emails you. But actually, this is huge. And if people start to embrace what they can do, it will not only save lives, but potentially, I think over time, it possibly will save money in places like the NHS and stuff like that. It's not good for local authorities necessarily, but yeah, it's going to be as broad as the technology. If you think most of us now, you know, smart homes have been talked about forever. You know, I've got a few CCTV cameras. I've got a few, you know, smart switches where you just plug it in and you can turn the lights off remotely. Some of us got, you know, smart boilers, all that kind of business. And it's all a bit kind of, you know, some good stuff and back stuff. But actually, potentially, in the telecare world, the biometric side of it, to be able to know that your granny is well and she's looked after and even see her maybe, all suddenly becomes possible. And, okay, it's not without cost, but IP does deliver an awful lot more, actually, than it takes away.
No, I fully support that, John. It's quite interesting. I had a demonstration of an Amazon Alexa device, you know, something you can buy for 29 quid on sale at the moment, linking into a call center. And you just say, yeah, Alexa, please call the call center. Mine's going to wake up in a second, well, hopefully not. And ring the call center. Now, that is not a recognized telecare device. It doesn't meet necessarily the EN standards in terms of peripherals, etc. But certainly is a complementary device, you know, for next to nothing. And the fact it's an IoT device, it's very much plug and play. We shouldn't forget, just as a very basic observation, one of the challenges with any analog device, the PSTN device or a dial-up device, is if it goes faulty, the call center won't know, because clearly if it's faulty, it can't actually create the link, the dialing link between the device and the call center. And I think almost without exception, digital devices will have a facility whereby they can be interrogated by a router or a server to actually check that it's connected to the network, so that if the digital device becomes disconnected, in other words, somebody's chopped through the line coming into your property, then the service provider should be informed of that within minutes. And that's just that simple change is a huge step forward in terms of a digital device and the ability to interrogate and make sure it's continuing to work, as opposed to an analog device, which the only time you find out it's not working is quite often when you trigger an emergency. So yeah, a fairly significant benefit there in its own right. Richard, again, coming back to yourself, if I may, it's a question raised by Franz Hermes. What are the major critical factors for an effective and sustainable implementation of telehealth technology in the UK? So this is telehealth rather than telecare. And in the main, I think telehealth very much depends upon digital devices.
Okay. If it's okay, I will answer that, but I will broaden it out a little bit to include kind of tech more generally, because I do think the line between telehealth and tech is increasingly blurred now, and people use the terms interchangeably, but recognize that there is a difference. I think, yeah, there are a lot of opportunities around this, and I think as I said before, you can kind of lose sight of some of the opportunities around the digital technology by us understandably being concerned about keeping the existing service going during this transition period. I think to answer the question, I think that the kind of the two things around the success of telehealth are making sure that you're buying the right technology and making sure that you have the people and processes in place to then fully exploit that technology. As I was saying before, there's a lot of kind of digital wash flowing around, so it's about making sure that the technology you're buying is actually going to do what it says, in terms of, is it going to give you access to the data you need? Is it going to be in the right format that you can actually get at and do something with in order to get you the insights that you need? But I think putting the technology to one side, we've done a couple of studies looking at telehealth, and where it sits in terms of people using it and scaling it, and what you tend to see is a lot of pilot projects, small scale, relatively short-term pilot projects, but those pilots don't kind of scale or tend to last much beyond the kind of the period that they were initially funded for. They tend to show that the technology works. It's not an issue with the technology. What tends to mean that they kind of wither away is around the people and processes that sit behind them. So I mean, fundamentally, you know, telehealth and tech provides much more information on the well-being and health of your service users, the patients, and it just comes down to some of the questions around who is it that's responsible for receiving that information, who is it that's responsible for interpreting it, deciding whether a response is provided, and then who is it that actually provides that response, and that can get quite complex quite quickly, just in terms of it can sit between responsibility between health and social care. There can be a lot of interaction needed there, and with community groups, etc. So making sure that kind of the non-technology stuff around making sure you've got the right resources, the right training, and the right processes in place to actually respond to all of these insights that this technology can provide is really key, and often forgotten about.
Thanks very much for that, Richard. We haven't done this on one of these sessions before, but I can see that we still have 88 participants. What I would like to try and do is a simple question and a show of hands. So, you know, if you agree to the proposition, if you can just sort of put your hand up, leave for 10 seconds, and then put it down, and we can get a measure. You know, of the people attending this discussion, question, you know, do we believe that, you know, we have an issue with analog devices? In other words, do we believe the analog devices will work on this at the end of the day? Or are we concerned that, you know, we do need to move towards digitalization? In other words, the alarm devices, analog devices aren't going to give us the answer we're looking for. So if you think analog devices are going to be a problem going forward, can you please quickly put your hand up? So I've asked this, and now I can't quite understand how to actually measure it, because I did that yesterday. But Julia or Jerry, if you're on the call, perhaps you could have a quick look at that and come back and just interrupt and let me know how many people thought of.
I could tell you, Steve, there's 24 on the attendees that have said yes to your question out of 73, so it's actually a minority.
Yes. Okay, that's interesting. Perhaps you should take some encouragement from that. Okie doke. DCMS. If I could come to Gillis, it's a very specific one. Is DCMS considering financial support for care lines to avoid digital transformation costs being passed on to vulnerable residents? I'm not sure if that is the role of DCMS.
That was going to be my response. So in a word, no, we're not considering specific support for care lines, mainly because it's not, as you say, necessarily the remit of our departments. It goes back to what we said earlier, that different parts of even government own different things of this increasingly like complex supply chain. What we are doing is obviously our set of ministers have told us specifically that alongside critical national infrastructure, the things that we're worried about, the sector we're worried about the most is probably telecare. It's the one sector we really, really want to work as flawlessly as possible post the migration. So we are monitoring the sector very closely. We're very happy to make whatever introductions we can between the telecare sector and the communications providers, and we are regularly engaging with yourselves, with communications providers, with Ofcom, and with all other interested parties to make sure that this works.
Okay, thank you. A bit of a generic question to Sodi. I presume you're still out there, Sodi.
Yes, I'm still here. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
I'll turn my video back on.
Yeah, thanks. How concerned are BT at the relatively slow introduction of digital devices, or as a corporate entity, are you concerned at all?
Yeah, we're very concerned. Yeah, no doubt about it. It remains, one of, if not our biggest challenge to migrating our customers off legacy WLR products onto the newer digital services. I don't want to ramble on, but when we first started this program, we didn't want to end up in a situation where we left the migration of our most vulnerable customers to the end of the program. We want to do them early as possible. But unfortunately, for lots of reasons, I mean, John Livermore explained them quite eloquently, the challenges, the industry faces, and we've got COVID and the cost of living crisis and technology shortages now kind of extending that. But yeah, we're very concerned with this. It's a very significant, important customer group that none of us can afford to get wrong. But we need, the industry to kind of support this and do their bit. I mean, I don't want to paraphrase and rephrase everything again, but from what I've seen, I've come into this sector. Okay, I've been doing this a couple of years now, but I've learned a lot about the telecare industry. I was initially quite saddened and surprised how old some of the tech is that's out there, both in dispersed and sheltered schemes. But I was also really encouraged by, there's a lot of fantastic proactive monitoring digital equipment that's out there used in other countries. And I thought, surely this is a great step change in the industry, to move away from reactive kit, because, it just doesn't seem right that you've got telecare alarms where the person who's incapacitated has somewhere got to reach for and press a button to call for help. Whereas these days there's proactive kit there that can monitor people's well-being and well in advance let someone know there's something wrong here. So surely this is something that should have been done years ago, and the kit is there, but I understand there's challenges getting there. So it's a big issue for us. We want to do as much as we can to encourage industry and help. So we're working with Sarah and the other CPs to see what more we can do. But yeah, absolutely.
David, your observations on the same question. Are you guys concerned, or are you fairly relaxed at what's happening?
Certainly not relaxed. No, I mean, I think as everyone has said, telecare and telehealth is a key priority area. We know that's an issue. We've been working with the sector for several years now, going back to well before any migration started. And I think we're still having these discussions because we still need better collaboration, better working practices on both sides, so that we reduce the risk to ultimately the people who are at the sharp end, which are the end users. And I think everybody on this call and everybody in both industries is absolutely committed to ensuring that we don't have those negative results. But as it stands today, there are still these risks out there for all of the reasons that we've been discussing this morning. So I think, yeah, certainly personally and at VMO2, we're looking at any new ways that we can try and minimize that risk, whether that's technology ways or whether it's communication ways. So, looking to work, for example, with local authorities, could we do something better to reach the nearest and dearest of users as a way to get attention of these people, so that the awareness of a migration is even happening? Could we look to seed communications in community hubs like libraries, doctors' surgeries? All of these things are constantly being discussed, and we're very, very keen to try and work out what really works, what can really work, and what can make a difference. Going back to it, no silver bullet, but we are desperate to find as much push towards a good solution as possible. So yeah, still very worried, still very much working towards getting it better.
Thank you. Phil, perhaps you can respond on behalf of TalkTalk, but just to add an element, a question to the question. A lot of people out there, heard 10, 20 years ago about the government dropping the FM radio frequency and everything would be digital. And of course, it ended up rolling and rolling and rolling. I suspect, John, like your eyes are going to be in a second. Is that 2025 date going to be extended, or is that really pretty much a drop dead date? For those people out there that think, the analog network will still be running in another 10, 15 years' time. Is that the case, or is it literally much more of a hard edge than that?
I think John will be better placed to answer that.
Such a shame. I thought I was going to get away with that.
I've seen no indication from anybody that the 2025 date is going to be extended.
No, in fact, I think it should be 2024. Should we do that? That would be even better, wouldn't it? I don't think it can be. I'm not saying that it won't, because political powers being what they are, we've got an election next year. Although government departments at the moment, and Giddis will bear this out, the fact that effectively the government's position is industry led. Who knows what the future holds? But 2025, in my opinion, has to remain as a hard date. The reasons for this have never been frippery. Isn't it's a good idea to go digital? It's been, as I said earlier, the exchanges are dead on their feet. They are 40 years old. They are creaking. We can't get parts. We can't get people to maintain them. If we don't do it by 2025, I think there's a danger that we may see whole exchanges disappearing from working. We'll have whole areas, like a power cut, not work anymore because it would just go into meltdown. There's only so much you can nurse these systems. There are 5,500 exchanges. They are, some of us on this call, there's lots of very young faces, but one or two of us are past our sell-by date, and this exchange is absolutely there. It's on its last legs. If we don't do it, we'll regret it. And the second thing I would say, purely personally, my own view, I get asked this pretty much every day, is that I think if we suddenly went back, for example, a year, I think everybody would take their foot off the gas. I don't think people would turn around and go, good, that's now an extra year to get it done. I'm going to get it done. A lot of people, in my experience, go, good, someone else will be doing my job in a year's time. Let them worry about it. And that's my concern. We just lose all focus on it.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to John's point, the core intent here is to maintain a reliable phone service, so that services, the telecare services that go over the top of that, can continue to provide that suitable lifeline service to end users. If we carried on with the PSTN for the reasons that John said, and this is very much what Virgin Media's view is in terms of its own network, that service would become less and less reliable from 2025 onwards. So you would then be creating a risk to the very same users that we are trying to, or we have the concern about that ultimately is the reason for this call and discussion.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the PSTN network was never designed to do this job in the first place. It was designed to carry voice calls, and so that just adds into the mix really that it is coming to the end of its life and time to move on.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Just coming back to yourself, David, and I don't know whether the CPs here have any observations or could even comment on mobile networks, but is there a similar challenge about to face us in terms of the decommissioning of certain networks in the UK? I don't know where we are, but I'm very aware that in Europe, 2G has been switched off in a number of countries. Switzerland, certainly, I think Norway is decommissioning 2G. And is there a sort of a similar legacy problem there going to hit the mobile space as Analogue is hitting the terrestrial network?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And the last thing you want to do is to replace a device with a mobile device that you then get told is about to be turned off as well. So, 2G, 3G sunset is a separate discussion to PSTN switch off, but it's obviously linked because of the two parallel technologies which give a route to connections. So I think it is a very real question that faces the industry. We've faced it, and we've made sure that the backup units that rely on cellular coverage are all upgraded to 4G units, so that avoids any short-term issues. I think exact dates are less set in stone. There are different plans for different networks, but yes, I think it's a very relevant question to ensure that whatever solution you want to move to is going to be a good, solid, medium, long-term solution for you. So you don't want to jump to something that will be turned off very quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a broad area, and certainly a much broader discussion point than we have time for in this panel. But it's perhaps, Jerry, something that we could consider for a future panel discussion. Perhaps, Sarah, I'm conscious you've been fairly limited on pulling you in, so perhaps give you the last word. Is there any general observations you have about what more we could be doing as a sector? And for that, I mean the CPs, the telecare service providers. And are we doing everything we can in terms of communication? Are we doing a good job, or do we need to do more?
I love having the last word. I think, are we doing everything we can? No, I don't think we are. I think the fact that we're having this conversation, it's beginning of 2023, but there's actually not that much time, and the feeling that I'm getting is that we may almost be out of time, and only the resolutions in the supply chain and really getting things moving is going to resolve that. So I don't think we're in the best place. That being said, the fact that this is happening, we're having these discussions, the communication providers, Openreach, are making their test labs available. Everyone on this call is because they are interested in knowing what they can do, what they should be doing, and speaking to CPs to understand that. That's all great. As far as communications go, there's been a fair level of calls for communication providers to raise the general awareness out there with their customer base. And the reason that awareness isn't as high is because for many customers, it's not their time to move, and there's a feeling that by communicating more about this, it may cause more unnecessary concern and confusion out there. But I do think communications, and I was very happy to see everyone was doing this kind of thing. Of the telecare side, perhaps that could be increased. And I think the willingness to work together, because this is something that we can only resolve by working together, that's heartening to see. So I think one of the things that I'm going to be looking at doing, and that was my homework set by Michael Swaffield, is getting kind of these consistent communications in place so that everyone's kind of speaking the same language. So I'll be looking at what we can do to kind of to bring those all into one place and to get something that's perhaps more meaningful where people are using the same language. So anybody interested in working on kind of communications, please do get in touch. I don't know if I could put my email address in the chat, or I'm easy to find through Tech UK. But I'd like to increase communications, not to the end customer, but within industry. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. I did say the last word, but I missed, sorry, that you put your hand up, and I think you've possibly answered that in the text now. But yeah, please come in, but literally 1 minute, and then I need to pass back to Jerry.
No, that's fine. Still, I put a note out there. I think it was an important point you raised about 2G, 3G sunset. Given that there's a proliferation and a move towards mobile-based technologies, it's no surprise 2G and 3G sunsets are being announced by the providers. So yes, so please, it probably is a separate topic to bring up, but make sure that if you are buying those solutions, that they are future-proofed and there's a path to make sure they're 4G, 5G compatible.
Yeah, I've got this horrible feeling that people in good faith 3 or 4 years ago bought a digital telecare device without realizing it may not be as digital nor as long term than they anticipated when it was purchased. Thank you, panel, for all of your input. Absolutely fantastic, a great bunch, and it's delightful to see you all again. But I now need to pass back to Jerry to allow Jerry to wrap things up. So once again, thank you very much, and across to you, Jerry.
Thank you very much, Steve. Again, thank you to all the panel as well. Do stay on, because I think we retained over 70 delegates through the whole of this 2 hours, which shows how big and important and urgent to the delegates that this subject is. So my takeaways from this are on the challenge side, and there's a challenge side. What's come across is there a consistent plan by telecare providers for the transition, and is that plan have options with it as to which way to go? And I don't get the impression that we have that, and to a great degree I think this is where organizations like ourselves and the TSA need to be supporting those providers to actually have a plan that they can work to, because time is running out. The tricky question about testing data has been going on, I think, for far too long. We do need to have, from everyone, I think, the CPs particularly are trying to do something in terms of providing the labs, but is it transparent enough, the data we're collecting? Is it widely spread enough? Do we communicate it enough? I think another urgent issue that's come through from today's discussions. And finally, in those challenges is identifying the telecare users. We tried to collect ARC numbers. I think, Sodi, you led to a great degree on looking at whether we collect service users numbers. Is this something that's still feasible? Is it something we can still work with them in the timescales? Or I think there were other suggestions where we're talking about the responsibility being with the providers to identify and communicate with their own users to enable them to go through this process. I think we need to either bottom out the identifying of the users or find another way to address that. So I think there's a lot of work for the providers in a very short space of time. And I think we need to ensure that they have the help and support to achieve that. We looked at the opportunity side in terms of how digital would enable us to have more predictive, proactive systems, engage with telehealth more, data analytics, AI, Internet of Things. And I think, Richard, you challenged us in the fact that let's make sure it works prior to just adopting these systems. But they are these opportunities, and we all know they are. And particularly important are these opportunities when we look at where we are in health and social care. We see the GP shortages, we see social care in crisis, particularly in the workforce, where beds are being taken up by people who can't come out of hospital and go back into being supported by social care. And we see acute care suffering through the aftermath of COVID, winter pressures and ambulance services suffering with not being able to get patients into hospital. Now, all these things we have the opportunity to address through the digital technology that is coming in, but it's just a process. And where does that come from? Both the challenges and the opportunities, I think we've talked about. We haven't resolved the funding issue, and it's very unlikely that we will do that in the short term. So my question around the funding issue is, do we pursue through the APPGs and central government that there is funding to do this? Or as a lot of the larger monitoring suppliers and commercial organizations have suggested, should this be a commercial business case to move into these new sectors, and who are the players in this? So a few answers, but a lot of questions still to be answered from today. And I think we'll carry on to support as much as we can through running these events, having the information on our website, and involving ourselves with all the partners in this going forward. I think there's an urgency. I think we've raised a lot of questions today, and I think discussions will take place offline to discuss this. So I look forward to updating our delegates in the future. I look forward to engaging with all of you who are on the call today. I really appreciate that, to answer some of these questions, but answer them in a very agile and urgent way. So those are my comments. I don't know whether you want to follow up on any of that, Steve, but we've hit exactly 1 minute past 1. So thank you, everyone.
No, stay safe, everybody, and